Welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. So, yesterday, President Biden made sort of the big Democratic Party campaign speech ahead of the midterm elections. It was an interesting speech to listen to. But I fear that it's actually not going to necessarily have the desired effect. And kind of want to go into why, what's going on, and whether American democracy is really in trouble. Now, first I would say, let's go into the latter point here. Well, I don't know. That American democracy is in trouble kind of depends upon how you define American democracy, right? But Biden's speech did a few things that I think were ultimately very well intentioned, but ultimately failed to address many of the actual problems which the rise of the Trump Republican dimension is very much a reaction against, right? So I think I want to start with this question of, is American democracy under threat? Well, yeah, that depends upon what you mean by American democracy. But I think if you ask a wide variety of Americans, pretty much all of them will probably say, yeah, it's under threat. How it's under threat and who's threatening it, they may disagree with viciously, right? But most Americans understand that the democratic process is breaking down for them in ways that can cause a number of problems. Which problems they want to prioritize, and whether democracy is an appropriate solution to which some of those problems are things that they would disagree with. As somebody who grew up in rural America and has a very rural outlook, I would say that the Democratic Party hasn't been any more pro-democracy than the Trump Republicans. The reason why I say this is that the definition of approaches to social problems that then get forced on the rest of the country by urban America largely. And by the way, I'm not just talking about Democrats here. Republicans from urban America also force their solutions on everybody else. And usually when we go to the voting booth, we are given an idea of urban Democrats versus urban Republicans, and rural America is largely left out. That leads to a lot of hard feelings, right? And there are a lot of reasons for that, right? So culture war topics that basically get decided in the cities and then pushed onto the countryside aren't really very helpful, right? And I think that Biden tried to allude to that a bit when he said that government needs to be a place where we come and mediate our differences rather than a place where we fight over our differences. But I haven't watched the Democrats back away from any of that. In fact, Biden pretty clearly didn't back away from any of that in his speech. So what a lot of Americans are going to be asking is, why are we asked to have a truce in a culture war that the other side, that by a side that's not engaging in a truce, right? It's not going to really work out for him. Okay, there was one thing in his speech that I think really set my hackles up, okay? And I have to preface this by saying that I've been critical of pretty much every president in my adult life. Even when I was considered myself a Democrat, I didn't stop criticizing Democrats. I was quite critical of Bill Clinton, for example, and in fact, this was why I noticed that Donald Trump in 2016 was running on Bill and Hillary's records. because he was very good at promising to do all the things which the Clintons had done that had harmed a lot of people. People who were cheerleading one party or another missed out. And as a result, a lot of Democrats didn't vote for good reason. Hillary Clinton's campaign was, I'm not Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's campaign was, I'm like Hillary Clinton, but I'm not going to ship your jobs overseas. And that's basically what happened in 2016. Now, what Biden said that really got my heckles up was the idea that we're going to have another American century the world needs us to. The world doesn't. For most of the world, the American century has been one form of oppression or even genocide followed after another, right? We've seen multiple cases of this in Indonesia, for example. We've seen multiple cases of this many other places. Now, there are certain things which the United States does as a world hegemon that aren't going to be easy to replace, right? And probably the US will keep doing them for some time, right? This includes protecting worldwide shipping to some extent. I think China's moving in the direction of trying to do more of that. My guess is that as the United States has to contract its military, we will see much more in the way of regional protections on shipping and far less of a single hegemon doing that. But that's one area. Every other aspect of peace and security, it's basically like the United States is like, okay, we're the only country that gets to enact regime changes as we want. It's our job to put right-wing dictators in other countries. And if any other country does it, then they're bad. Especially if any country purports to do it to the US. That would be terrible. It's our job to do it to countries like Nicaragua or Indonesia or places, right? And this is a really big problem, right? Anyone in the US with an immigrant background who is a voting Democrat at this point is now put in a position of having to ask themselves, do I really want these people in power? Or do I want a shift towards a more multipolar world? And so I suspect that this speech is actually going to drive, for that reason away, a certain part of the Democratic voting base, people who are naturalized citizens from other parts of the world who have typically voted Democrat simply because the Republicans are more overt in their anti-immigrant statements, while the Democrats tend to pass more anti-immigrant legislation. So no, I don't think it's going to have a big effect. Is democracy under attack? It is, from two different directions and in two different ways. Actually, three different directions and three different ways. But like many cases, people have a tendency of overlooking their own side's faults and enjoying or slamming their opponents. So what I see is I see three areas. The first one is there is a strong effort to make sure that rural America stays under the heel of Democratic Party voting cities. And this is a really big problem. Okay? This means you have to destroy or dismantle local organs of government or take away decisions that they should have in order to ensure that they do whatever the urban-centric folks want them to do. I'm going to bring up a point here that I'm sure will be very controversial, but like when I was going to school, like the gyms typically had open showers, right? In other words, everybody in the class was taking a shower, or all the boys in the class, gym class, were taking showers in one room, and all the girls were taking showers in another room, and there wasn't any privacy in that regard. The idea that high school students who identify as one gender have to have a right to take showers in the other room is going to open up a lot of problems for places that have these sorts of open showers. And if your solution is that schools have to go back and retrofit everything for privacy, then that's saying they can't spend that money on something else. So one of the things that we almost never talk about is we never talk about the fact that funds are limited. And maybe if somebody is saying you have to do this, maybe the party that's saying you have to do this should be the one to pay for it, right? But we don't do that because personal responsibility, and so now it's one side telling the other side what they have to pay for, and that also means they're not paying for other things that could benefit their community more, right? And this also means that any other possible accommodations that could be reached within the community can't be considered because somebody else has already decided that a particular solution has to be the way forward. And this is dangerous, okay? This is the sort of government as a battleground of groups that Biden seemed to try to want to warn against at the end. But then you can't warn against that and then continue on the same sort of culture war efforts, because that's where it all comes from. The second major threat to American democracy comes from the wealthy overclass, the capital-owning class, that largely is able to have a strong say in what the media covers or doesn't cover, therefore which candidates are acceptable or not. And so by the time people go to the polls, the candidates that we get a vote for are largely selected by this particular group of, top 0.1% of society, largely. And that group is not ethnically and religiously very diverse. They are mostly, I guess what the political correct term for it would be WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It is this group that controls the banking system. It is this group that controls the media. No, it's not the Jews. And it's not all white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It's a small set of them who were well positioned to profit off of the rise of industrialism in the North, for example. People like Bill Gates. So people like Warren Buffett, right? And this degree of control is what the Democratic Party's rules regarding superdelegates, etc., are all designed to protect, and it's also what the DCCC uses as a deciding. It's also the force behind the decision on when the DCCC will allow primarying of a candidate or not, and. So this is a problem. And Biden's speech fit very well into sort of a warrior for the wealthy. This is a problem. The final one, and this is where Biden pointed the finger at the Make America Great Again crowd, is in the shift away from a liberal democracy and towards what we might call a stabilitocratic democracy. We see some of this under Trump. We are not going to see the last of it. We also see, I think, a lot of it under the Democrats today. The idea of stability. Okay, so the idea of a liberal democracy is rights come before the state. People have rights that the state's not allowed to intrude in. Even in cases of national security, civil rights have to take precedence, right? Among those individual rights are a right to property. But as we know from Adam Smith, once the government's established for the security of property rights, it's established for the security of the defense of the wealthy against attacks by them from people who are not as wealthy. That's just Adam Smith for you. So So that's the problem with liberal democracy, and it's the sort of democracy that Biden here is defending. The other view here is that government is a manifestation of the society, and it is the guardian of the society. This is the stabilitocratic model. People like Orban, like Le Pen, like Modi, like Erdogan. Basically, the idea is that the state is there to protect people from threats from outside, including and threats from inside, right? And so I would argue that the efforts at thinking that it's the state just needs criminal justice to deal with January 6th or Donald Trump or things like that is a very stabilitocratic model. Same thing with pointing the finger at Russia over 2016. Very stabilitocratic model, right? It's not just Donald Trump, right? The Make America Great Again crowd is at the bleeding edge of it, but the Democratic Party is on the cutting edge of it. So, yeah, it's under threat, and I don't see any of the parties as being helpful at this point. But then that leads to a question, like, what is democracy? Is the United States even democratic? If we define democracy by having an actual opposition, I'm not sure the United States is a democracy. If we define democracy just by the right to vote and the formal structures and institutions, then it seems to be. But if we look at how likely it is that widespread personal grievances against the government can be addressed, the United States is not a democracy, right? And so these are all areas where the United States has fallen short dramatically. And I don't see an easy way of getting them resolved. I'd also add that many of these are built into the American experiment. One of the things that seemed kind of strange to me here in Europe is that if something happens to me badly because of the government doing something, right, whether it's the train's not running right and consequently I can't get to work, or whether it's businesses being closed by the pandemic. There is a tradition here in Europe that people are entitled to monetary compensation, but the United States decided very, very early on that that wasn't the case. So we have the 11th Amendment. In fact, if there's one constitutional amendment that should go away, it's probably the 11th Amendment. If people could get monetary compensation for being harmed by the government, we might have a more responsive government where grievances by the people could be more easily addressed. You're not going to find anybody in power willing to take that step. So where does that leave us, and where does it leave the United States? The American century is over. People put the ending point at different times. Some people might put it 2001 with the terrorist attacks in New York. Some people might put it 2003 with the invasion of Iraq and George Bush saying that we weren't going to wait for the United Nations. Some people will put it at the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. Some people will probably put it at the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022. But somewhere in those 21 years, the American empire, ceased to be a hegemon, right? It ceased to be the power that could go and do whatever it wanted in the world without repercussions. And so that's over. That's not coming back. Biden can dream. He can reminisce. He can think that the United States is always a force for good in the world, and I don't think that's true. I don't think you can look at the Indonesian genocide of 1965 and 1966 as being a force of good. I don't think you can look at the U.S. involvement in the violence in East Timor as being good. I don't think you can look at the U.S. putting Pinochet into power as being good. So the American century is over. Right? We're heading into a multipolar world, whether we like it or not. And what's particularly missing from this is an idea of democracy which is tempered from its liberal beginnings, right? By the 1990s, all we had were aggressively liberal parties in the United States. Any pretense of social democracy among the Democrats was dead. Any pretense of sort of Nixonian, almost Christian democracy was dead. And so this is a really big problem. I think that we've got to get to a point where things like navigation in dangerous areas, like through the Strait of Hormuz, for example, is assured by multilateral efforts on the naval front. And those need to include both Russia and China. Okay? So, the U.S. hasn't been a broker of peace and stability. It hasn't been a net defender of human life. So, the world really doesn't need another American century. And because of that, this is going to have a lot of impacts internally within the United States. Government spending will get more expensive. The amount of money the U.S. has to spend on its military will get a lot less. And I think that the U.S. Military power machine is going to implode. But if we don't start taking care of our basic problems like healthcare, making sure that states are in positions to build public healthcare systems, internal transportation, making sure that state and local governments are in positions to build out transportation with appropriate support and help when it comes to shipping goods across the United States. Solving issues like, the U.S. rail system, which it suffers all of the inefficiencies and dysfunctions of monopolistic capitalism. That's one area that needs to be nationalized. And moreover, we need to be able to come together in our societies. And this is one of the things that I think Biden did try to communicate, even if it ended up being drowned out by the other aspects of the speech. And we have to come together and be able to talk about politics and difficult issues across differences. So if we can't do that, then what point is there? Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Hope you have a great day.